Donald Trump has once again shaken the foundations of global politics, this time by calling for sweeping tariffs on China while completely leaving out India in his fiery message to NATO. This isn't just another political headline. It's a signal of how Trump views America's rivals, allies, and the rapidly shifting balance of global power. At the center of his speech was a familiar theme: China as the main threat to U.S. industry and security. But equally striking was the silence. The fact that India, one of the world's fastest-growing economies and a key partner in the Indo-Pacific, was never mentioned. Why does this matter? Because in today's interconnected world, a single statement by a former U.S. president can send shockwaves through markets, alliances, and diplomatic relations. And by targeting China while omitting India, Trump has reignited questions about where the U.S. and NATO stand in the 21st century power struggle. In this video, we'll break down exactly what Trump said, why India's absence is so important, and what this means for NATO, China, and the future of global alliances. We'll explore U.S. China tensions, NATO's evolving role, India's rise on the world stage, and the ripple effects these moves could have on economies and geopolitics everywhere. So let's dive into the story behind Trump's words, and the silence that speaks just as loudly: Trump's call for China tariffs. When Donald Trump stood before the crowd and renewed his call for tariffs on China, it was more than just political rhetoric. It was a return to one of his signature policy weapons. Trump framed China as the single biggest economic threat to the United States, accusing Beijing of manipulating trade, exploiting U.S. markets, and undermining American manufacturing. His proposal? Sweeping tariffs designed to punish Chinese imports, protect American jobs, and send a clear message that the U.S. will not be taken advantage of under his watch. This stance is nothing new. During his first term, Trump launched a full-scale trade war with China, slapping tariffs on everything from steel and aluminum to consumer electronics. That conflict defined a large part of his presidency. And while critics argued that tariffs raised costs for American consumers, his political base rallied behind the image of a president willing to stand up to China. It tapped into a deeper sense of economic insecurity, one that blames globalization and outsourcing for hollowing out America's industrial heartland. By reviving this policy on the campaign trail, Trump is once again pressing the button that resonates most strongly with his supporters. The idea of forcing China to pay, whether directly through tariffs or indirectly through lost exports, fits neatly into his populist message of economic nationalism. But the impact goes far beyond American borders. Economists warn that renewed tariffs could disrupt global supply chains, drive up prices, and spark retaliatory measures from Beijing. NATO allies, many of whom rely on stable trade with China, would also feel the squeeze. European manufacturers, in particular, could see ripple effects as tariffs reconfigure global trade routes and push costs upward. For Trump, however, those ripple effects are secondary to the central narrative: America first, China under pressure. And his political base reassured that he is still the fighter who won't back down. The NATO message and India's absence alongside his tough talk on China, Trump delivered a pointed message to NATO: America's allies must step up and contribute more. This was a familiar refrain, echoing his previous criticisms that NATO members have long underfunded their defense budgets while relying too heavily on U.S. military might. In his latest remarks, Trump emphasized the importance of strengthening Western alliances to counter global threats, a call that resonated with European leaders wary of Russian aggression. But here's where the speech took an interesting turn. While NATO allies were directly named and called to action, India was entirely absent from the conversation. This omission was not lost on analysts. India today stands as one of the fastest-growing economies, a rising global power, and a critical U.S. partner in countering China's influence in the Indo-Pacific. Yet, in Trump's framing of global alliances, New Delhi did not appear. Why does this matter? Unlike NATO countries, India is not a formal treaty ally of the United States. It partners with Washington through frameworks like the Quad, alongside Japan and Australia, rather than through NATO structures. Still, India's growing weight in global affairs makes its absence conspicuous, especially when the subject is China. Politically, leaving India unnamed could signal two things. First, that Trump's priority remains reinforcing NATO rather than widening the alliance framework. Second, that India's role, while vital, is still seen as separate from the transatlantic theater where NATO dominates. For India, the silence may be both a snub and an opportunity, a reminder that its strategic independence remains intact, even as the U.S. leans harder on its European allies. In global politics, sometimes what is unsaid matters more than what is said. And in this case, Trump's silence on India speaks volumes. U.S. China trade war history to understand why Trump's latest tariff proposal carries so much weight. We need to revisit the history of the U.S. China trade war that unfolded between 2018 and 2020. It began when Trump imposed tariffs on billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods, citing unfair trade practices and intellectual property theft. Beijing retaliated with tariffs of its own, targeting U.S. exports like soybeans, pork, and automobiles. What followed was a tit-for-tat battle that rattled global markets. Tariffs were imposed on steel, aluminum, semiconductors, and consumer goods, sparking price hikes that affected both producers and consumers. American farmers, once confident in their Chinese export markets, suffered significant losses as Beijing turned to alternative suppliers. On the other side, Chinese manufacturers faced growing pressure as access to U.S. markets became more expensive and uncertain. The winners and losers were clear. Some U.S. industries, like domestic steel, received temporary protection, while others, especially agriculture, faced devastating consequences. Meanwhile, multinational companies found themselves caught in the crossfire, struggling to navigate disrupted supply chains and rising costs. Trump's defenders argued that the tariffs were necessary to bring China to the negotiating table, and indeed, the conflict culminated in the Phase 1 trade deal in early 2020. But critics pointed out that many structural issues remained unresolved, and that ordinary Americans bore the brunt of higher prices. Fast forward to today, and Trump's renewed call for tariffs evokes memories of that turbulent period. Supporters see it as a return to a tough stance that asserts U.S. dominance. Skeptics fear it could trigger another round of instability, especially at a time when global inflation and supply chain fragility remain pressing concerns. The history of the first trade war serves as both a warning and a blueprint, reminding the world that when the U.S. and China clash economically, the impact reverberates far beyond their borders. India's role in the global balance, perhaps the most intriguing part of Trump's message, was not what he said, but what he left unsaid. India's role. In today's geopolitical landscape, India is no longer just a regional power. It is the silent giant whose decisions can tip the balance of global alliances. India's importance stems from multiple factors. It is the world's fastest-growing major economy, home to more than 1.4 billion people, and projected to surpass Japan and Germany to become the third-largest economy within the decade. Its demographic advantage, a young, growing workforce, gives it economic momentum at a time when China faces an aging population. Strategically, India is vital to the U.S. effort to counterbalance China's rise. Through partnerships like the Quad, New Delhi has become a central player in Indo-Pacific security. While not a NATO member, India's cooperation with the U.S. in military exercises, intelligence sharing, and regional security initiatives underscores its importance as a de facto partner in the global struggle for influence. The omission of India in Trump's NATO message could be interpreted in several ways. Perhaps it reflects his narrow focus on transatlantic relations, leaving Asia for another context. Or perhaps it underscores India's unique position, powerful enough to matter, yet independent enough to resist being folded into Western alliance structures. From New Delhi's perspective, this omission may be quietly welcomed. Prime Minister Narendra Modi has long emphasized India's strategic autonomy, refusing to be fully aligned with either Washington or Beijing. At the same time, India understands that tariffs, trade wars, and shifting alliances directly affect its growth and security. In a world where China's dominance is increasingly challenged, India's rise represents both an opportunity and a counterweight. And whether or not Trump names it in his speeches, India's role in NATO's perspective. From NATO's vantage point, the priorities are clear: defending European security, containing Russian aggression, and maintaining unity among its 31 member states. Ever since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, NATO has doubled down on its core mission of deterrence in Europe. Yet, as global power dynamics shift, NATO has also started to look beyond its traditional borders. In recent years, NATO has shown increasing interest in partnerships across the Indo-Pacific. It has strengthened ties with countries like Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, recognizing that challenges in Asia inevitably spill over into Europe. Cybersecurity threats, maritime trade routes, and China's growing military footprint all make Asia relevant to NATO's future. That is why India's omission from Trump's NATO remarks is so striking. India, with its economic weight and strategic position in the Indo-Pacific, is exactly the kind of partner NATO leaders have been quietly eyeing. While India is not likely to ever join NATO, greater collaboration on counterterrorism, cybersecurity, and military exercises remains on the table. Europe's stance toward China complicates the picture. While Washington frames Beijing as a rival, European countries are more divided. Germany and France, for example, have deep trade links with China and worry about the costs of confrontation. India, on the other hand, is seen in Europe as a potential alternative partner, a democratic giant with a growing economy and a more palatable option than overdependence on China. For NATO, closer collaboration with India could bring significant benefits, diversifying supply chains, enhancing security in the Indian Ocean, and bolstering democratic partnerships. Which is why Trump's silence on India is not just a gap, it is a missed opportunity to align NATO's evolving global vision with one of the world's most important rising powers. Global economic implications tariffs are not just political statements. They ripple across the global economy. When Trump revived his call for sweeping tariffs on China, markets took notice. Investors know from experience that tariffs increase uncertainty, raise costs, and can trigger retaliatory actions. The first question markets ask is, who benefits? When the U.S. erects barriers against China, supply chains don't disappear, they move. In recent years, Vietnam and Mexico have emerged as major beneficiaries of the U.S.-China trade rivalry, absorbing manufacturing orders once destined for Chinese factories. India, too, is positioning itself as an alternative hub, with Apple and other tech giants shifting portions of their production to Indian soil. Europe, however, views tariffs more cautiously. As highly trade-dependent economies, European nations worry about collateral damage from a U.S.-China clash. German carmakers, French luxury brands, and European tech companies all rely on Chinese markets. If tariffs escalate, the EU could face slower growth, higher costs, and disruptions in critical supply chains. The ripple effects don't stop at trade. Energy markets could feel the strain as global shipping routes shift. Tech supply chains, especially for semiconductors, may face renewed bottlenecks if the U.S. restricts China's access further. Manufacturing, already under pressure from inflation, could see new price hikes. And yes, inflation is the silent threat lurking behind tariffs. By raising the cost of imports, tariffs inevitably push consumer prices upward. For a global economy still recovering from pandemic disruptions and inflationary spikes, another tariff wave could be the spark that reignites broader price instability. For Trump, tariffs are a political weapon. For the global economy, they are a gamble, one that markets, consumers, and governments will have to absorb, whether they like it or not. Why India was left out? Trump's omission of India has puzzled analysts, but there are at least three possible explanations. First, Trump may have been deliberately narrow in his NATO speech. NATO is, after all, a transatlantic alliance focused on Europe. By keeping his remarks tightly framed around NATO members, Trump avoided complicating his message with references to non-members like India. Second, it could have been a strategic choice. India's role in global geopolitics is significant, but naming it in a NATO context might blur lines. Trump has long favored simple, direct messaging. NATO pay your fair share is cleaner than NATO and India must work together. Leaving India out may have been about clarity, not dismissal. Third, U.S. election politics plays a role. On the campaign trail, Trump thrives on painting clear villains and heroes. China is the villain, an economic aggressor taking American jobs. NATO, while often criticized by Trump, is cast here as a bloc that needs to toughen up. India doesn't fit neatly into that narrative. Highlighting India as a friend could dilute the sharper focus on enemy China. Still, the risks of overlooking India are real. New Delhi is increasingly shaping global trade, security, and technology debates. Ignoring its role could alienate Indian policymakers or reinforce perceptions that the U.S. still sees Asia only through a China-centric lens. Indian media, known for its sensitivity to global recognition, will surely dissect Trump's silence. While policymakers in New Delhi may shrug it off as campaign rhetoric, ordinary Indians could interpret it as a slight, especially given the country's growing expectation of global acknowledgement. Sometimes silence speaks louder than words, and in this case, Trump's silence on India leaves room for both speculation and criticism. The political angle, 2024 and beyond, everything Trump says right now must be filtered through the lens of 2024. His campaign strategy is clear: an unapologetic return to America first, anchored in anti-China rhetoric and calls for economic nationalism. The message is designed to resonate with voters who feel left behind by globalization and betrayed by international institutions. In that strategy, tariffs become more than economic policy. They are campaign slogans. Promising to make China pay plays well in swing states, particularly in the industrial Midwest, where manufacturing jobs remain a potent symbol of economic decline. Where does India fit into this? For Trump, India is not a wedge issue in the same way China is. However, the Indian-American diaspora has become an influential voting bloc in U.S. politics. Both Republicans and Democrats have ramped up outreach, recognizing that the diaspora is affluent, engaged, and concentrated in key states like Texas, New Jersey, and California. Democrats tend to emphasize shared democratic values and cooperation with India on climate and technology. Republicans, on the other hand, focus on security and economic ties, themes that resonate with Trump's base. Whoever wins in 2024, India will remain a bipartisan priority. But in the short term, Trump's omission of India likely reflects campaign discipline rather than a strategic shift. His goal is to keep the spotlight on China as the enemy and NATO as the partner in need of tough love. India, though vital, does not serve that narrative. Looking beyond 2024, however, U.S. foreign policy debates will have to grapple with India's rising role. Whether Trump or Biden is in the White House, Washington cannot afford to ignore the world's largest democracy. Lessons and reflections. So what lessons can we draw from this episode? At the broadest level, Trump's call for tariffs underscores the persistence of U.S.-China rivalry. No matter who occupies the Oval Office, the U.S. is locked into a long-term contest with Beijing. Tariffs, alliances, and rhetoric are all weapons in that struggle. Second, India's omission is a reminder of NATO's Western-centric DNA. Even as NATO explores Indo-Pacific partnerships, its heart remains in Europe. For India, this is both a challenge and an opportunity. The challenge, not being named in key speeches, may feel like a slight. The opportunity, it reinforces India's ability to chart an independent course, free from formal entanglements. For viewers, the takeaway is simple: geopolitics is not abstract. When leaders talk about tariffs, alliances, or rivalries, it directly affects jobs, prices, and security. A tariff that raises costs in Washington can lead to price hikes in London, Berlin, or New Delhi. A NATO decision in Brussels can influence military strategy in the South China Sea. For India specifically, the lesson is clear: don't depend on recognition from Western leaders to define your role. Build strength, deepen partnerships on your own terms, and let global powers adjust to India's rise rather than waiting for validation. In short, this episode is about more than Trump, NATO, or tariffs. It's about how a shifting world order is forcing countries, companies, and citizens to adapt. And India, even when left unspoken, is right at the center of that transformation. Conclusion: Donald Trump's latest remarks combined two familiar themes: tariffs on China and pressure on NATO. But what stood out most was not what he said, but what he didn't. By omitting India, Trump left analysts questioning how America sees its partners in a world where Asia is rising fast. The call for tariffs revives memories of the U.S.-China trade war, with all its economic costs and political symbolism. NATO's central role in Trump's speech underscores the continued importance of Europe in U.S. strategy. Yet India's absence is a reminder that global politics remains fragmented and that not every key player fits neatly into Western frameworks. The message for viewers is clear. Global politics is shifting, and the choices leaders make today ripple through economies, alliances, and ordinary lives. India may not have been mentioned, but it is still shaping the balance of power in ways that cannot be ignored. So here's the question. Do you think Trump should have mentioned India? And how will new tariffs affect your economy, your job, or your daily life? Let us know in the comments below. And stay tuned. In our next video, we'll dive deeper into how India might respond and whether NATO is truly preparing for an Indo-Pacific future. Shaping the future of global power is undeniable.